Sunday shootings in Londonderry in January 1972. It was one of the most controversial incidents in Northern Ireland's violent past. 13 people died after the parachute regiment opened fire on a civil rights march of some 10,000 people. The soldiers claimed they had been fired on first, but the Savile inquiry, which took 12 years to report, absolved the victims of blame.
Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies.
As a young officer in the Royal Dragoon Guards, Robert Ford took part in the D-Day landings and was mentioned in dispatches. After victory in Europe, he found himself in charge of a challenging situation. British soldiers who'd been expecting to return home were instead ordered to the Far East, where the war against Japan was continuing. Some 200 of them refused to board the ship, so Acting Captain Ford was told to put down the mutiny.
The orders came down that we were to fix bayonets and that we were to move forward in column abreast and to force them up the gangplank. Right. If necessary, bayoneting our own soldiers. And I had my troop and I lined them up and we started moving forward. And as we got halfway towards them across the dockside, they all lost their nerve. And you know, the leaders were arrested by the military police and I believe they were hanged.
He was very warm, very human. I think related well to soldiers and they to him.
The former Chief of the General Staff, General Sir Mike Jackson, was a young adjutant with the Parachute Regiment when General Ford took command in Northern Ireland. In 1971, internment without trial for suspected IRA men had just been introduced by the British authorities, and some Republican areas of Derry had been declared no-go zones. Sir Mike says General Ford was concerned about violence from all sides.
I know he was very worried about the deteriorating security situation, particularly after internment in the autumn.
All factions in the Catholic community united against internment under the banner of civil rights.
It was a very difficult time in Northern Ireland, very challenging indeed, but he always seemed on top of it.
Douglas Murray wrote a book called Bloody Sunday, Truth, Lies and the Savile Inquiry.
The situation was deteriorating by the day. Attacks from every side, on every side.
How long were you in Northern Ireland?
2 years. 2 years in Northern Ireland. Thoroughly enjoyed it, because it was an operational setting which I liked. And Bloody Sunday happened at the beginning.
So where were you when Bloody Sunday took off? Were you in...
On Bloody Sunday, I was in Londonderry, watching it.
Tell us then about the events of Bloody Sunday. How did the day unfold?
On the 30th of January 1972, there was a demonstration that was due to take place in Derry, Londonderry. This was in a context where there had been serious unrest at similar protests between soldiers and demonstrators. The decision to deploy one para undoubtedly remains among the most controversial. A lot of the people in one para had very, very recently been fighting in combat situations and been training. Some had just come in from Cyprus, some had just come in from Aden. Using the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment for what was likely to be a scoop-up and arrest operation is a very highly questionable judgment.
Questionable for what reason?
Because one para had a reputation for, by then, much more aggressive behaviour.
Do not fire back for the moment, unless you identify a positive target.
The audio recordings have General Ford at one of the barricades saying, "Go one para." Now, he certainly was not suggesting, he was not saying, "Go get them," as in shoot them. There was no evidence that's ever been uncovered that the senior figures in the army actually wanted what happened to happen. But nevertheless, he did urge them through the barricades, and of course now we know from the Savile report definitively what happened as a result.
I understand that the troops had a yellow card with the rules of engagement written on it. What were those rules of engagement?
Well, they're highly specific.
Each and every soldier and policeman, of course, had to take responsibility for their own actions, and the famous yellow card laid out as to what their legal powers were to open fire or otherwise. In the end, it came to their decision. So it wasn't for General Ford or anybody else to say to Soldier X, shoot that man over there. That would not have been the case.
One of the interesting things is the de facto rationalisation to try to align with the yellow card what was clearly beyond what the yellow card allowed, i.e. to say that the person shot at X point was holding a nail bomb, for instance, and was in the act of throwing it at a soldier.
Which was not true.
Which was not true.
There was great confusion at the time, wasn't there? Because Wampara definitely opened fire and a number of people were killed. But immediately after those events, General Ford himself said that they had been fired on by the demonstrators.
Yes.
The official version is that 200 rounds were fired at your troops, yet local people say that you fired first. Can you be absolutely sure that the rounds were directed at your troops first?
Certainly. I can't specific about 200 rounds, but there was certainly in excess of 150 and probably something between 150 and 250. But there were a lot of rounds fired.
Among those local eyewitnesses who say that your men fired first and indiscriminately, there are priests, local priests and doctors. Would you say that they are lying?
I hesitate to call anyone liars, but the facts are we were fired at first.
They immediately got onto the television screens in order to make sure that it wasn't just the IRA story as they saw it that got out there, and were, of course, hoist on their own petard. However, it is the case that there was civilian firing on the army, but that it was not the firing which would in any way have justified the firing that Wampara did. And in actual fact, the firing that occurred and that killed people was in directions that were not the directions which provably were where some civilians did indeed fire from. And by civilians, really, what I mean is official IRA.
Right. So when General Ford appeared on the TV and the radio in the immediate aftermath of Bloody Sunday and said that more than 150 rounds had been fired on his soldiers, he was mistaken, or was he telling a deliberate untruth?
I think he was mistaken. But in the immediate aftermath, General Ford went on the television and said what he thought had happened, and he was wrong, as is often happens after such an occasion. But that was, and understandably, held against him in the years afterwards.
What did the Savile inquiry find about General Ford's involvement in all of this?
The inquiry did not criticise General Ford, but the reason why Ford played a role in the inquiry in particular was because of a memorandum that was unearthed after the inquiry was set up. There was a document discovered that was known as the Ford Memorandum. It was written only a few weeks before Bloody Sunday and expressed some views about how to deal with what were known as the Derry Young Hooligans. He says, the gangs of tough teenage youths who've developed sophisticated tactics of brick and stone throwing, destruction and arson. He said a minimum force necessary to achieve a restoration of law and order would be to shoot selected ringleaders among the Derry Young Hooligans. Undoubtedly, the Ford Memorandum played a very large role in the post-2000 inquiry. Was it actually a smoking gun? In the end, it seems not. It's a proposal he had, a controversial proposal, which very clearly was not what was enacted on Bloody Sunday.
He was, however, ultimately responsible for these soldiers.
Yes.
Must he not be held culpable in some way?
I think it is very important, and the Savile inquiry bears this out, to separate those things which people should be blamed for and those things which they cannot be blamed for. We now know we have a highly specific view of what happened from every imaginable direction, from thousands of witnesses. But the thing that will always linger over Ford's reputation, certainly, is that first mistake of deploying Wampara in the first place.
How the history books will say it, I don't know. I hope they will see him as a man of integrity, doing a very difficult job to the best of his ability.
General Sir Mike Jackson on General Sir Robert Ford, who's died aged 91.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.